Welcome back to our Flat Stanley chapter book. Open up to chapter 2, Being Flat. It's on page 7. All right, so the first chapter just talked about how Flat Stanley got flat. So remember, a bulletin board fell on him while he was sleeping, and his doctor and his mom and dad said that they're just going to have to change his clothes and get used to it. So let's continue reading. When Stanley got used to being flat, he enjoyed it. He could go in and out of rooms, even when the door was closed, just by laying down and sliding through the crack at the bottom. Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop said it was silly, but they were quite proud of him. Arthur got jealous and tried to slide under a door, but he just banged his head. Being flat could also be helpful, Stanley found. Let's think about that. How is one way that being flat could be helpful? On the page. He was taking a walk with Mrs. Lambchop, his mom, one afternoon when her favorite ring fell from her finger. The ring rolled across the sidewalk and down between the bars of a grating that covered a deep, dark shaft. Mrs. Lambchop began to cry. Can you relate to Mrs. Lambchop? Have you ever lost something that you really, really liked or that was really important to you? How did it make you feel? Let's continue. I have an idea, Stanley said. He took the laces out of his shoes and an extra pair out of his pocket and tied them all together to make one long lace. Then he tied one end of that to the back of his belt and gave the other end to his mother. Lower me, he said, and I will look for the ring. Thank you, Stanley, Mrs. Lambchop said. She lowered him between the bars and moved him carefully up and down and from side to side so that he could search the whole floor of the shaft. 2 policemen came by and stared at Mrs. Lambchop as she stood holding the long lace that ran down through the grating. She pretended not to notice them. What's the matter, lady? The first policeman asked. Is your yo-yo stuck? I am not playing with a yo-yo, Mrs. Lambchop said sharply. My son is at the other end of this lace, if you must know. Get the net, Harry, said the second policeman. We have caught a cuckoo. What are they saying? We have caught a cuckoo. They're implying that Mrs. Lambchop is crazy. They don't believe her that her son is at the other end of the lace. Just then, down in the shaft, Stanley cried out, Hooray! Mrs. Lambchop pulled him up and saw that he had the ring. Good for you, Stanley, she said. Then she turned angrily to the policeman. A cuckoo indeed, she said. Shame. The policeman apologized. We didn't get it, lady, they said. We have been hasty. We see that now. People should think twice before making rude remarks, said Mrs. Lambchop, and then not make them at all. The policeman realized that was a good rule and said they would try to remember it. One day, Stanley got a letter from his friend Thomas Anthony Jeffrey, whose family had moved recently to California. A school vacation was about to begin, and Stanley was invited to spend it with the Jeffreys. Oh boy, said Stanley, I would love to go. Mr. Lambchop sighed. A round-trip train or airplane ticket to California is very expensive, he said. I will have to think of some cheaper way. When Mr. Lambchop came home from the office that evening, he brought with him an enormous brown paper envelope. Now then, Stanley, he said, try this for size. The envelope fit Stanley very well. There was even room left over, Mrs. Lambchop discovered, for an egg salad sandwich made with thin bread in a toothbrush case filled with milk. They had to put a great many stamps on the envelope to pay for both airmail and insurance, but it was still much less expensive than a train or airplane ticket to California. So let's stop there. How did Stanley get to California? What was their plan? Go back and reread if you can't remember. The next day, Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop slid Stanley into his envelope along with the egg salad sandwich and the toothbrush case full of milk and mailed him from the box on the corner. The envelope had to be folded to fit through the slot, but Stanley was a limber boy, and inside the box he straightened right up again. Mrs. Lambchop was nervous because Stanley had never been away from home alone before. She rapped on the box, meaning she tapped the box like that. Can you hear me, dear? She called. Are you all right? Stanley's voice came quite clearly. I'm fine. Can I eat my sandwich now? Wait an hour and try not to get overheated, dear, Mrs. Lambchop said. Then she and Mr. Lambchop cried out, Goodbye, goodbye, and went home. Stanley had a fine time in California. When the visit was over, the Jeffreys returned him in a beautiful white envelope they had made themselves. It had red and blue markings to show that it was airmail, and Thomas Jeffrey had lettered it, valuable and fragile, and this end up on both sides. Back home, Stanley told his family that he had been handled so carefully he never felt a single bump. Mr. Lambchop said it proved that jet planes were wonderful, and so was the Postal Service, and that this was a great age in which to live. Stanley thought so too. All right, that is the end of chapter 2. Nice job, boys and girls.